This is William James Pye. Take a close look here. He was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1993 murder of his girlfriend. Tonight, his attorney putting together a last-minute effort to stop his execution. Pye had a clemency hearing today. It has just been denied. This is breaking. We just got this into our Atlanta News First newsroom. His attorneys argued that he was intellectually disabled, had an IQ of about half the nation's average. Pye's attorneys also say he faced profound poverty and violence when growing up and suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. Pye had an on and off again romantic relationship with the victim. In court, there were gruesome details about her rape and murder that came to light that led to his death sentence. Pye's attorneys do not deny his guilt, but they argued that because he is disabled, he should not be eligible for execution. However, again, as we've just learned in our newsroom, that request has been denied. Pye is set to be put to death by lethal injection tomorrow. Tori, Blair, back to you.
March 20th, 2024. 11:03 p.m. Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. Inside execution chamber number 1. The air is thick with anticipation and the sterile smell of disinfectant. Witnesses sit in uncomfortable silence behind reinforced glass. The only sounds, the soft whisper of air conditioning and the rhythmic beat of monitoring equipment. On the gurney, strapped down with leather restraints, lies Willie James Pye, 59 years old, nearly 3 decades on death row. Tonight, Georgia breaks its 4-year execution hiatus. The warden steps forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mr. Pye, do you have any last words? Willie James Pye lifts his head slightly, looks directly at the warden, and with complete clarity says just one word. No. One word. No. Not I'm sorry. Not I'm innocent. Not a plea for forgiveness or a declaration of remorse. Just no. But this sterile, calculated execution, this clinical ending to a human life, stands in stark contrast to the brutal, chaotic violence that brought Willie James Pye to this moment. 31 years ago, on a warm May evening in 1993, Alicia Lynn Yarbrough was living her life. 21 years old, a mother tried to build a future. She had no idea that her ex-boyfriend was planning something that would not only end her life in the most horrific way imaginable, but would ultimately lead to this moment. This cold, quiet room, these witnesses, this final word. Who was Willie James Pye? What transformed a relationship into murder? And what did that final no really mean? To understand that final no, to truly grasp what it meant and why it matters, we need to go back to a time when Willie James Pye was a free man walking the streets of Georgia. Back to when Alicia Lynn Yarbrough was alive, vibrant, and had no idea that her past was about to catch up with her in the most devastating way possible. Because this isn't just a story about an execution. This isn't just about a man who said no when asked for his final words. This is a story about obsession, jealousy, and violence. About a justice system that took 31 years to deliver its verdict. About a victim whose name deserves to be remembered long after a killer's final breath. This is a story of how no became the last word in a case that would haunt Georgia for 3 decades. May 12, 1993, 31 years earlier. May 1993, Georgia. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough was everything a 21-year-old should be. Full of life, working hard, building dreams. She had that infectious laugh that could light up a room and the kind of spirit that made people gravitate toward her. She was a mother now, trying to create stability for her baby, trying to move forward. But moving forward meant leaving Willie James Pye behind. At 28, Willie was 7 years older than Alicia, and those 7 years felt like a lifetime of difference. Where Alicia saw possibility, Willie saw ownership. Where she wanted growth, he demanded control. Their relationship had been a roller coaster, passionate highs followed by devastating lows. On again, off again, with Willie always believing he could pull her back in. But this time was different. This time, Alicia had found someone new. She had a baby. She was building something real. And Willie James Pye absolutely could not handle that. May 12, 1993. The day everything changed. Willie James Pye wasn't planning to kill anyone that Tuesday morning. At least, that's what he would later claim. The original plan was simple, a robbery, easy money. Him, Chester Adams, 25, and Anthony Freeman, just 15 years old. But here's where this story takes a dark turn that will chill you to the bone. Because this wasn't really about money. This was about Willie's wounded ego, his toxic sense of entitlement, and his complete inability to accept that Alicia had moved on. The robbery? That was just the cover story. The excuse. The way to get his accomplices on board with what he really wanted to do. You see, Willie had been watching Alicia. He knew her routines. He knew when she'd be alone. He knew about her new relationship, about the baby he was convinced was his, about the life she was building without him. And in his twisted mind, if he couldn't have her, if he couldn't control her, then nobody could. Wait, what? This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was personal. This was planned. This was revenge. Evening of May 12th, 1993. Alicia's home. Alicia was having a quiet Tuesday evening at home with her baby. Just another normal night in what she hoped would be a normal, peaceful life. She had no idea that 3 men were approaching her door. She had no idea that her ex-boyfriend had been planning this moment, watching her, waiting for exactly this opportunity. When Willie James Pye, Chester Adams, and Anthony Freeman forced their way inside, Alicia's world shattered in an instant. They didn't just rob her. They ripped her away from everything she knew, everything she was trying to build. They took her from her baby, that innocent child left behind, too young to understand why mommy was suddenly gone. The 3 men forced Alicia into their car and drove her to a motel. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. This was methodical, calculated. They had to drive to a location. They had to get a room. Every single step was a choice. At that motel, they did unspeakable things to her. They violated her in every way possible. But even that wasn't enough for Willie James Pye. Even destroying her dignity, even taking everything from her, wasn't enough to satisfy his rage. So they drove her to another location, a remote area where no one would hear, where no one would find her quickly. And there, Willie James Pye forced Alicia to her knees and shot her execution style 3 times in the back of the head. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough's last moments on this earth were filled with terror, pain, and the knowledge that she would never see her baby again. She died not because of anything she had done, but because a man couldn't accept that she had the right to live her own life. Her body was discovered that same day, but the damage to her family, to her child, to everyone who loved her, that damage was permanent. If cases like Alicia's matter to you, if you believe her story deserves to be heard and remembered, then you need to subscribe right now. Because there are hundreds of victims whose stories are being forgotten while you're deciding whether to hit that button. Don't let Alicia become just another statistic. May 12th, 1993. Later that evening, the call came in before midnight. A body had been found in a remote area outside town. When investigators arrived at the scene, they knew immediately this wasn't just another homicide. This was something far more sinister. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough lay face down, 3 gunshot wounds to the back of her head. The execution-style killing was brutal, calculated, professional in its cruelty. But the crime scene told a larger story. There had been a struggle. There had been fear. There had been time for her to know what was coming. Back at her home, police found the baby unharmed but traumatized, crying alone in the house. The front door was damaged, clear signs of forced entry. Personal items were missing, jewelry, cash, suggesting robbery. But seasoned detectives knew better. The level of violence, the personal nature of the crime. This felt like more than money. This felt personal. This felt like revenge. And that's where they started looking. 48 hours later, the breakthrough came faster than anyone expected. Anthony Freeman, just 15 years old, was a weak link in Willie's plan. Under intense questioning, the teenager cracked like an eggshell. It was Willie's idea, Freeman blurted out during his third hour of interrogation. He said, "We were just going to rob some houses." But then he started talking about this girl, his ex. Detective Johnson leaned forward. "What girl, Anthony?" "Alicia. He was obsessed with her, man. Said she thought she was too good for him now. Said she needed to learn a lesson." The confession came pouring out. Every detail. The planning. The surveillance. The real motive behind what everyone thought was a simple robbery gone wrong. Freeman laid it all out. How Willie had manipulated him in Chester Adams. How the robbery was just a cover story. But confessions can be recanted. Testimonies can be questioned. What sealed Willie James Pye's fate was science. DNA evidence. Irrefutable. Undeniable. Willie's genetic material at the crime scene on the victim, linking him directly to the rape and murder of Alicia Lynn Yarbrough. The web was tightening. May 15th, 1993, 72 hours after the murder, when officers arrived to arrest Willie James Pye, he was sitting on his front porch like he didn't have a care in the world. No panic, no attempt to flee, just waiting. "Willie Pye, you're under arrest of the murder of Alicia Lynn Yarbrough." His reaction? Stone cold silence. No denial, no shock, no emotion whatsoever. Detective Williams would later describe it as the most chilling arrest I've ever made. He looked at us like we were interrupting his afternoon. Chester Adams was picked up an hour later. Unlike Willie, Adams broke down immediately, sobbing as the handcuffs clicked into place. Freeman was already in custody, having confessed everything. 3 men, 3 completely different reactions to being caught for the same horrific crime. The evidence against them was overwhelming. DNA, confession, physical evidence, witness testimony. It was what prosecutors call a slam dunk case. But for Alicia's family, watching the arrest on the evening news brought no relief. Their daughter was gone. Their grandbaby was motherless. And now began a legal journey that would stretch across 3 decades, a marathon of appeals, hearings, and hope for justice that seemed to drag on forever. June 1996, Georgia Superior Court. 3 years after Alicia Lynn Yarbrough's murder, the courtroom was packed. Media filled the gallery. Family members clutched tissues. And Willie James Pye sat at the defendant's table, showing the same stone-cold demeanor that had chilled investigators during his arrest. District Attorney Sarah Mitchell rose to address the jury, her voice cutting through the tension like a sword. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear will disturb you. It will anger you, and it should." The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. They presented Anthony Freeman's detailed confession, walking the jury through every horrific moment of May 12, 1993. Freeman, now 18, took the stand and testified against his former accomplices with painful clarity. "Willie said we were going to rob some houses," Freeman testified, his voice barely above a whisper. But then he started talking about teaching his ex-girlfriend a lesson, about showing her who was boss. Then came the DNA evidence. Irrefutable scientific proof linking Willie James Pye directly to the rape and murder. The forensics expert explained to the hushed courtroom how genetic material doesn't lie, how science had painted an undeniable picture of guilt. Crime scene photos flashed on screens. Jurors gasped. Some looked away. The brutal reality of what had been done to Alicia was laid bare in excruciating detail. The execution-style gunshots, the evidence of sexual assault, the cold, calculated nature of her murder. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning. If the prosecution had delivered a masterclass in building a case, Willie James Pye's defense was a textbook example of how not to defend a capital murder case. Defense attorney Robert Johnson walked into that courtroom with what should have been powerful ammunition. Willie had suffered severe childhood trauma. He had been raised in crushing poverty. Most importantly, psychological testing would later reveal an IQ of just 68, a score that placed him in the intellectually disabled category. In many states, that IQ score alone would have taken the death penalty off the table. But Johnson presented none of this evidence. Zero. He called no psychologists, no childhood trauma experts, no social workers who could have testified about Willie's mental limitations. He painted no picture of a man whose brain simply didn't function like others. Instead, Johnson's defense lasted exactly 2 days. He essentially told the jury, "Yes, my client did this horrible thing, but please don't kill him for it," without giving them a single compelling reason why they shouldn't. This wasn't just inadequate representation. This was abandonment, and it would become the foundation for nearly 3 decades of appeals, with courts repeatedly calling Johnson's performance constitutionally deficient. The damage was done. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. We, the jury, find defendant, Willie James Pye, guilty of malice murder. Guilty on all counts: murder, kidnapping, rape, armed robbery, burglary. Then came the sentencing phase. The same jury that had just convicted him now had to decide life in prison or death, without any mitigating evidence, without any context for Willie's actions, without any reason to show mercy. The decision was swift. Death. Willie James Pye showed no emotion as the judge read his sentence. Death by lethal injection for the murder of Alicia Lynn Yarbrough. Life sentences for the other charges to run consecutively. At 31 years old, Willie James Pye was officially condemned to die. But this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning of a legal odyssey that would stretch across 3 decades, involve multiple appeals courts, and ultimately raise questions about intellectual disability, inadequate counsel, and whether justice had truly been served. The truth about what really happened in that courtroom, and why this case will haunt the legal system for decades, is something most people will never know, unless you're subscribed to this channel. Because we're about to expose the shocking truth about how this case was really handled. Hit subscribe now, or you'll miss the most disturbing part of this story. While Willie James Pye sat on death row awaiting his fate, his co-defendant Chester Adams was serving his own sentence just a few cell blocks away. But Adams would never face the needle. 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. That was Adams' punishment for his role in Alicia's murder. The same crime, the same victim, the same brutal night in May 1993, but a different outcome entirely. Why? Adams wasn't considered the ringleader. He didn't have the personal connection to Alicia that Willie did. He wasn't the one consumed by jealousy and rage. In the eyes of the law, he was a follower, not a leader. So while Willie counted down the years toward his execution, Chester Adams settled into the routine of life behind bars. No appeals, no death warrant, no final meal to plan. Just a slow, grinding reality of spending the rest of his natural life in a concrete cell. Some might call him the lucky one. But the most shocking twist in this tale of justice? Anthony Freeman's story. Remember, Freeman was just 15 years old when he participated in Alicia's murder, a juvenile. And more importantly, he was the one who confessed, the one who gave investigators the roadmap to Willie and Chester, the one whose testimony helped seal their fates. Freeman received a life sentence, but as a juvenile, he was eligible for parole after serving 25 years. On December 18, 2020, while Willie James Pye was still fighting for his life on death row, Anthony Freeman walked out of prison a free man. He had served 24 years. He was 39 years old. He had a chance to rebuild his life, to start over, to become something other than the scared teenager who helped murder Alicia Lynn Yarbrough. Wait, what? Think about that for a moment. The man who confessed to participating in this brutal crime, who helped rape and murder a 21-year-old woman, was walking the streets of Georgia in 2020. Meanwhile, Willie James Pye was still waiting to die for the same crime. Freeman had cooperated. Freeman had talked. And Freeman had gotten the ultimate reward, his freedom. So let's break this down. 3 men committed the same horrific crime on the same night against the same victim. Willie James Pye, death row for 31 years, executed March 2024. Chester Adams, life without parole, still incarcerated. Anthony Freeman, free since 2020. How does that make sense? How do you justify such wildly different outcomes for the same brutal murder? The answer depends on who you ask. Prosecutors would say cooperation matters. Defense attorneys would say the system is broken. Victims' rights advocates might argue none of them deserve mercy. But one thing is certain, Alicia Lynn Yarbrough got only one fate, death, and that's the only justice that truly mattered. Imagine waking up every single day for 28 years knowing that the state plans to kill you. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. That was Willie James Pye's reality from the moment he arrived at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in 1996. Death row isn't like regular prison. It's a different kind of hell entirely. 23 hours a day in a 6 by 10-foot concrete cell. 1 hour of recreation in a slightly larger concrete box. No physical contact with visitors. Only conversations through reinforced glass. Meals slid through a slot in the door. You might think that after a few years, you'd get used to it. You'd be wrong. The waiting is what breaks most men. Not knowing when your number will be called. Watching other inmates get taken to the execution chamber while you remain. Some find religion. Others lose their minds entirely. A few, like Willie, simply exist in a state of emotional numbness. Over nearly 3 decades, Willie James Pye became institutionalized in the most extreme way possible. A man waiting to die, watching his life tick away one concrete day at a time. For 28 years, Willie James Pye's case bounced through the court system like a deadly game of legal ping pong. Appeal after appeal after appeal, each one offering a glimmer of hope, each one ultimately failing. His lawyers hammered the same points repeatedly: inadequate counsel, intellectual disability, constitutional violations. The courts listened, deliberated, and almost always said the same thing: denied. But then, in 2021, something extraordinary happened. A 3-judge panel of the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals actually agreed with Willie's lawyers. They vacated his death sentence, ruling that his original trial attorney had been so incompetent that it violated Willie's constitutional rights. For a brief moment, it looked like Willie James Pye might actually escape the death chamber. You might think that would be the end of it, that justice had finally recognized a flawed trial. You'd be wrong. In 2022, the full appeals court reversed that decision. They put Willie back on death row. The legal system had given him hope, then snatched it away again. The appeals continued right up until the very end. On March 20th, 2024, the day of his execution, Willie's lawyers made one final desperate attempt. They appealed directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's response? Denied, unanimously. But that last-minute appeal did delay the execution by several hours. Willie James Pye was originally scheduled to die at 7 p.m. Instead, he didn't receive the lethal injection until 11:03 p.m. Those final 4 hours of hope before the inevitable. Appeal after appeal after appeal. Each one raising the same questions about justice, fairness, and whether the system had truly worked as intended. Here's the detail that will make your blood run cold. Willie James Pye had an IQ of 68. To put that in perspective, an IQ below 70 is considered intellectually disabled. In some states, that alone would have saved his life. The Supreme Court has ruled that executing intellectually disabled individuals constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. But Willie's original lawyer never presented this evidence, never had him properly tested, never brought in experts to explain what an IQ of 68 actually means. The inability to fully understand consequences, difficulty with abstract thinking, problems with impulse control. The evidence went deeper. Signs of fetal alcohol syndrome, potential brain damage from childhood trauma, a man whose mind simply didn't function like yours or mine. You might think the courts would have considered this compelling evidence. Some did. That 2021 appeals court that vacated his sentence? They were troubled by these revelations about his mental capacity. But ultimately, the legal system decided that Willie James Pye understood enough to die for his crimes. Here's what most people don't realize. By supporting this channel, you're helping expose cases where the system might have failed. Cases where justice might not have been served properly. If you care about holding our legal system accountable, if you believe these stories need to be told, then subscribe. Because walking away now means letting these injustices stay hidden. For nearly 4 years, Georgia's execution chamber had sat empty. The last time the state had taken a life was January 9th, 2020, Jimmy Fletcher Metters, executed for a 1987 convenience store murder. Then COVID-19 changed everything. Lockdowns, social distancing, disrupted court schedules. Even death row ground to a halt. Appeals that should have been heard were delayed. Executions were postponed indefinitely. The machinery of state-sanctioned death simply stopped. But by 2024, Georgia was ready to flip the switch again. Willie James Pye would be their comeback execution. The case that would announce to the world that Georgia was back in the business of delivering ultimate justice. After 1,505 days of silence, the execution chamber would hum back to life. It's almost poetic in its cruelty. Willie had spent 31 years waiting to die, only get an unexpected 4-year reprieve because of a global pandemic. For extra years to wake up each morning on death row. For extra years to wonder if today would be the day. But time had finally run out. Willie James Pye was about to become a statistic in Georgia's long history with the death penalty. Since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976, Georgia had executed 75 people before Willie. 75 lives ended by the state's hand over nearly 5 decades. Willie would be number 76. More specifically, he would be the 54th person executed by lethal injection, Georgia's preferred method since 1998. Before that, it was the electric chair, Old Sparky, as death row inmates grimly called it. Georgia ranked fourth in the nation for total execution since 1976, trailing only Texas, Virginia, and Oklahoma. The state had built a reputation for efficiency in carrying out death sentences, though the COVID hiatus had temporarily slowed their pace. Of those 75 previous executions, only one had been a woman, Kelly Gissendaner, in 2015. The rest were men like Willie, men who had committed heinous crimes and exhausted their appeals. Now Willie would join that grim roster. Another name on the list. Another number in the state's execution statistics. But statistics don't capture the human cost. They don't tell you about the 31 years of waiting, the families torn apart, or the questions that linger long after the needle finds its mark. By 2024, Georgia had a problem. Their death row was overcrowded with 37 condemned inmates, and the 4-year execution hiatus had created what officials called a backlog of justice. Public opinion remained divided. Polls showed Georgians split almost evenly on capital punishment, some viewing it as necessary justice for the worst crimes, others seeing it as an outdated, barbaric practice that had no place in modern society. Victims' rights groups pressed for executions to resume. These families have waited long enough for justice, argued Sarah Martinez of Victims United. Every day these killers remain alive is another day their victims stay dead. Defense advocates push back just as hard. We're not executing justice, argued civil rights attorney David Chun. We're executing the mentally ill, the intellectually disabled, and those who never received adequate representation. But politics aside, the state had made its decision. Georgia was ready to restart its execution protocol. Willie James Pye would be the test case, the man chosen to break the 4-year silence of Georgia's death chamber. Ready or not, the machine was starting back up. March 20th, 2024, 3 p.m. Willie James Pye's final meal request was delivered to his cell at exactly 3 p.m. 2 chicken sandwiches, 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, 2 bags of plain potato chips, 2 lemon-lime sodas. Look at that order for a moment. Notice anything? Everything came in pairs, double portions, as if he was ordering for 2 people, or maybe trying to fill a void that 28 years of prison food had carved into his soul. Psychologists say final meal requests reveal something profound about the condemned. Some choose childhood comfort foods, mac and cheese, ice cream, their grandmother's recipes. Others go elaborate, lobster, filet mignon, exotic dishes they've never tasted. A few refuse to eat it all. Willie chose simple, familiar foods. Fast food, comfort food, the kind of meal you might grab on any ordinary Tuesday when you're not thinking about much of anything. But this wasn't an ordinary Tuesday. And the man eating this meal wouldn't see another sunrise. He ate slowly, methodically. Guards watched through the cell door slot. No conversation. No emotion. Just the quiet sound of a man consuming his final calories on Earth. The last taste buds he would ever experience firing for the last time. After finishing his meal, Willie was allowed his final visits. Family members arrived first. Relatives who had watched him waste away on death row for 3 decades. The conversations happened through reinforced glass, using phones to communicate. No touching, no hugs, no final physical contact between a condemned man and the people who still love him despite everything. His sister wept openly. His elderly mother, frail and heartbroken, pressed her palm against the glass. Willie remained stoic, emotionless, the same cold demeanor he'd maintained since his arrest in 1993. At 5 p.m., Reverend Michael Thompson arrived for spiritual counsel. Unlike family visits, this conversation remained private. What did they discuss? Did Willie express remorse? Did he finally break down and show emotion? We'll never know. The chaplain's lips are sealed by sacred confidentiality. His legal team made one final visit at 6 p.m., armed with laptops and cell phones, still working frantically on that last Supreme Court appeal. They explained the timeline, the process, what would happen next. Willie listened with the same blank expression he'd worn for 31 years. These were the last free conversations of his life, the final human connections before the state would claim him forever. At 7 p.m. sharp, Willie James Pye should have been strapped to the gurney, but his lawyer's final Supreme Court appeal had bought him precious hours. The execution was on hold while 9 justices in Washington, D.C. decided his fate one last time. In the witness viewing area, media representatives checked their phones constantly. Alicia's family members sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, waiting for the closure they'd sought for 31 years. Prison officials paced nervously, unsure whether tonight would be the night or another delay. The execution chamber itself waited in sterile silence. The gurney with its leather restraints. The IV lines already prepared. The single chair where the executioner would sit, hidden behind one-way glass, ready to press the button that would send pentobarbital coursing through Willie's veins. At 9:47 p.m., the news came down. Supreme Court denied. Unanimously, the machinery of death lurched back into motion. Willie was moved from his holding cell to the execution chamber. Witnesses were called back. Media alerted. The clinical precision of state-sanctioned killing resumed its methodical pace. 11:03 p.m. became the new 0 hour. Guards escorted Willie into the chamber. He walked calmly, showing no resistance, no fear, no emotion. Just a man accepting what he'd known was coming for 31 years. The final walk, the last few steps of his life. He was strapped to the gurney at exactly 11 p.m. The warden stepped forward, his voice official and cold. "Mr. Pye, do you have any last words?" Willie James Pye lifted his head slightly from the gurney, looked directly at the warden, and spoke clearly. "No, not I'm sorry. Not I'm innocent. Not a plea for forgiveness or a message to Alicia's family. Just no." But when Reverend Thompson offered a final prayer, Willie nodded his acceptance. The chaplain's voice filled the chamber with words of grace and mercy, the last human sounds Willie would ever hear. At 11:03 p.m., the executioner pressed a button. Pentobarbital began flowing through the IV line into Willie's bloodstream. Witnesses watched as he took 6 quick, shallow breaths. His cheeks puffed slightly. His lips quivered once, twice, then went still. At 11:03 p.m., Willie James Pye was pronounced dead, 31 years after he murdered Alicia Lynn Yarbrough. The state of Georgia had finally extracted its price. One word. No. That's how it ended. March 21st, 2024, the morning after. For Tawana Bell, watching Willie James Pye die brought something she'd been seeking her entire adult life. Closure. After 30 years, I finally feel like my mother can rest in peace, Bell told reporters outside the prison. She was just a baby when Alicia was murdered, raised by relatives who kept her mother's memory alive through stories and photographs. He took my mama from me before I could even know her, but now it's over. Now, he can't hurt anyone else. But not everyone in Alicia's family felt the media coverage had been fair. Janetta Starks, Alicia's cousin, expressed frustration that news outlets seemed more interested in Willie's intellectual disability claims than in remembering who Alicia really was. "They're making him out to be the victim," Stark said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "They talk about his IQ, his childhood, his mental problems. But what about Alicia? What about the brilliant young woman who was building a life? What about her dreams that were cut short?" The family had endured 31 years of legal proceedings, appeals, delays, and false hopes. They watched Willie's co-defendants receive different sentences. They'd seen Anthony Freeman walk free while their loved one remained dead. But finally, it was over. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough was more than a murder victim. She was more than a name in court documents or a case number in legal files. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman with dreams and aspirations that extended far beyond the terrible way her life ended. In the years following her death, Alicia's family established, when she survives, a foundation dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and raising awareness about breast cancer, causes that had been close to Alicia's heart. Through this foundation, Alicia's memory became a force for good. Her death wasn't just a tragedy. It became a catalyst for helping other women escape dangerous relationships, for providing resources to families torn apart by violence, for keeping the conversation about domestic abuse in the public eye. "My mama didn't die for nothing," Tawana Bell often says when speaking at foundation events. Her story saves other women. Her legacy protects other mothers. This is what Janetta Starks meant when she criticized the media focus. While reporters obsessed over Willie's mental state and appeals, Alicia's family was quietly building something beautiful from the ashes of their tragedy. They were ensuring that Alicia's life mattered more than her death, that her impact would outlive her killer. Willie James Pye's execution raises questions that don't have easy answers. Was this justice, or was this revenge? Does an IQ of 68 make someone too impaired to face the ultimate punishment? What happens when the system fails to provide adequate representation? Georgia taxpayers spent millions keeping Willie on death row for 31 years. Millions that could have gone to victim services, crime prevention, or education. Was that money well spent? And what about the inconsistency? Why did Anthony Freeman walk free while Willie died for the same crime? Why did Chester Adams get life while Willie got death? 3 men, 1 victim. 3 different outcomes. Where's the logic in that? Perhaps the most troubling question of all. If Willie's lawyer had done his job properly in 1996, if the intellectual disability evidence had been presented, if the childhood trauma had been explained to the jury, would Alicia's family have found a different kind of justice? Some questions don't have answers. Some wounds never fully heal. But Willie James Pye's story forces us to confront them anyway. No. 1 syllable. 2 letters. A word so simple a child could say it. But when Willie James Pye spoke that word in Georgia's execution chamber, it carried the weight of 31 years, 3 decades of appeals, and a lifetime of questions that would never be answered. What did he mean by no? Was it a refusal to apologize? A final act of defiance against the state that was about to kill him? Was he saying no to acknowledging the pain he'd caused Alicia's family? No to showing the remorse they'd waited 3 decades to hear? Or was it something else entirely? Was it acceptance? A man with an IQ of 68, simply saying no to the complexity of final words, no to the expectation that he should have something profound to say about his life and crimes? Maybe no was the most honest thing Willie James Pye had ever said. No excuses, no explanations, no attempts to minimize what he'd done or justify the unjustifiable. Or maybe it was just the word of a man whose mind had been broken by 31 years of waiting to die, who had nothing left to give, not even words. The silence that followed spoke louder than any speech ever could. Did justice truly serve Alicia Lynn Yarbrough? After 31 years, after millions in taxpayer dollars, after decades of legal battles, was Willie James Pye's execution really what she would have wanted? Could this outcome have been different? If Willie had received competent legal representation in 1996, if his intellectual disability had been properly presented, if the jury had understood the full picture of his mental limitations, would Alicia's family have found a different kind of closure? What does this case say about our system's ability to balance mercy with justice? About our treatment of the intellectually disabled? About the arbitrary nature of who lives and who dies when 3 men commit the same crime? These aren't comfortable questions. They don't have neat, tidy answers. They force us to confront the messy reality of a justice system that's run by imperfect humans, making imperfect decisions about the most permanent punishment possible. Some might say Willie got exactly what he deserved. Others might argue the system failed everyone involved, including Willie himself. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But here's what we know for certain. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough's story doesn't end with Willie James Pye's execution. Her legacy lives on through. When she survives, through the women her foundation has helped escape dangerous relationships, through the awareness raised about domestic violence. Willie's final word was no. But Alicia's final word, spoken through her family, through her foundation, through every life saved in her memory, is yes. Yes to protecting other women. Yes to honoring victims. Yes to ensuring that someone's worth isn't defined by how they died, but by how they lived. Willie James Pye said no and died. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough's legacy says yes and lives on. Alicia Lynn Yarbrough was 21 when her life was brutally taken. Her story, her real story, not just how she died but how she lived, deserves to be remembered. If you walk away from this video without subscribing, you're walking away from justice for victims like Alicia. You're choosing to let their stories be forgotten. Don't let that happen. Subscribe now, because these stories matter. These victims matter. And your support helps ensure they're never forgotten.